This is a video recorded for Probability and Stochastic Process Homework 9 by patient 10. And the first video about the first question is, the problem setting is WT is a stochastic process with its expectation E of WT is equal to 0, and the RW of T1 and T2 is equal to alpha times the minimum of T1 and T2. And we also define a YT, where YT is equal to WT minus 1 when T is larger or equal to 1. And we also define YT is equal to 0 for any time T is equal to or less than 1. And we are supposed to find E of YT and RY of T1 and T2 and to determine whether YT is WSS. So we can solve this problem in two different situations. The first is when T is larger than or equal to 1. Then we have E of YT is equal to E of WT minus 1, which is essentially 0. And when we are trying to calculate out the RY of T1 and T2, it's equal to the expectation of WT1 minus WT1 minus 1. And similarly, it times the sum of WT2 minus WT2 minus 1. And essentially we can see we can rewrite this into like a more detailed form where it's multiplied by the same multiplier alpha, and within the bracket we get the minimum of we get the equation of like this: the minimum of T1 and T2 minus the minimum of T1 minus of T1 and T2 minus 1, and minus the minimum of T1 minus 1 and T2. Finally, we add up the minimum of T1 minus 1 and T2 minus 1. And we can see there are, other than the first and the last term, we need to determine the relative relation between these T1 and T1, T2, and T1 minus 1 or T2 minus 1. If we suppose like T1 is always larger than T2, we need to define two different situations, where the first is T1 minus 1 is larger than T2, and the second is T2 is larger than T1 minus 1, which is shown in the graphs like this in two different situations. In the first situation, we can get it to be essentially in the middle term, two terms can be determined to be minus T2 minus 1 and minus T2, but differently the second term can be determined to be T2 minus 1 minus T1 minus 1. And for the first term, we get the value of this Ry is equal to 0, and the second situation, Ry of T1 and T2 is equal to alpha times 1 minus the sum of T1 minus T2. So these are the situations for when T1 is larger than or equal to 1. When T is less than 1, we can always get Y of T is equal to 0, and the expectation of YT is always 0, and Ry of T1 and T2 is essentially 0 in all different situations. And we summarize all the above equations. We can get Ry of T1 and T2 is always equal to 0 when T1 minus T2 is larger than 1, or essentially whenever T is less than 1. And the second situation for Ry is equal to alpha times 1 minus the sum of T1 minus T2, and it happens when T1 minus T2 is less than 1. But we can see that Y of T is not always WSS, because when there are different values of T, it has different values of Ry and of T1 and T2, because it's different when T is larger than or equal to 1 or when T is less than 1. So we cannot determine the overall YT is WSS or not, because there are two different situations where it is determined by the value of T. So YT is not WSS. This is the end of this video record.